Hey everybody, quick video here. Essentially, I just want to take an opportunity to explain how I start off every Python project that I start working on, kind of how I go about setting it up on my computer, and at the end of the video I'm going to talk a little bit about the settings that I use for VS Code, just in case anyone's interested or curious or anything like that. So jumping right into it, I'm on my Mac right now. The other operating system I primarily use is Linux. I don't really have access to Windows. I don't really like using Windows, but you could do the same thing I'm doing on Windows. You just have to translate accordingly for the Windows equivalent of all the commands and such. So let's assume that I'm starting a new project called project. So the first thing I always do is go ahead and make a directory for my new project, which again, in this case, is just called project. After we create that directory, we change into it, list the contents. We can see that it's totally empty. Next thing I'm going to do is create a virtual environment. So for a lot of the projects that I work on, I tend to only use the Python standard library, which means, those are all the sort of imports that are available without installing anything. But there are two utilities that I almost always install in a virtual environment anyway for any project. And truth be told, in case I do need to install something, even if I just want to mess around or whatever, the virtual environment's there, that's good. So this is how we create a virtual environment. We call Python 3-m, we specify our venv module, and then we also create, this is the name of the venv. In my case, I just named it venv, which is a pretty standard thing to do in Python programming. After we go ahead and create the virtual environment, we need to activate it or source it. This essentially just adjusts our environment. So if I type something like which pip now, I can see that I'm pointing to the full path of the virtual environment. So the two tools that I almost always install in a virtual environment. One is Autopy 8. So Autopy 8 is a tool that you can use to automatically go through your code after you write it and format it. It accounts for things like the length of the line, and it will break things up for you. It'll put proper spacing between all your imports and function definitions and everything like that. I'll show you how that works real briefly at the end. And then the other one is VS Code really likes it when we have PyLint installed. So I usually just go ahead and get that going as well. And you can see most of these I've installed before, so they're all cached. I'm not downloading them right now. Your output might look a little bit different, but yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this now. So the other thing that I always do, I almost always check my code into version control at some point, and I use Git. So I host all my own repositories, and then I mirror them to GitHub. So you'll notice in the descriptions of all my videos, I often have links to the source. So the other thing is, though, when we commit files, so if I were to just type git add dot right here, which is not actually a Git repository, so this isn't going to work. But if I were to do that, the period basically says add all files. What the gitignore file does, which is what we're going to put in place in a second, is tells Git which files to ignore. So GitHub very kindly publishes a whole bunch of gitignore files for us for different languages and types of projects and stuff. So they have a generic Python one. So I'm going to go ahead and use curl here to download it and just paste in the link. Just got to fix my command real quick. So essentially with this -o flag, I can specify the name of the output. So I type .gitignore and then my link. So it's going to go ahead and download that. And now when I type ls-a, and I need -a because it's a hidden file, you can see I have my .gitignore. So we're going to look at that real quick just for a second. There's a couple things I want to point out. So one of the things I just mentioned that we don't want to put in our version control is our virtual environment. So looking here, we can see that the gitignore contains the venv folder, so we'll ignore that. Another one that will be relevant in a video coming up soon, db.sqlite3. So that's also kind of a standard name if you're working with a local SQLite database, is just calling it db.sqlite3. So as long as we stick with that name, it's already in our gitignore. Git will obviously ignore that file, and we won't accidentally add it to our version control. Now, of course, you can modify this file. So if you had, a media folder for static images you were hosting with a website or something, and you didn't want those to go into Git, which you wouldn't, you could add media to the gitignore. So that's pretty much it from the terminal side of things. I'm going to hop over here to vscode. I'm going to go ahead and open the folder that I just created, which again is just called project. So what's cool is once I do this, weird, okay, we open the folder, but we still get the welcome page. Is here in our project, we can see the virtual environments there, we can see the gitignore is there. I'm going to go ahead, create a new file, call it main.py. So this is another thing that I'm always going to do. I almost always am going to have a main.py. So I usually just put one in place with the bare minimum at the very beginning of starting a project. So first line is always going to be our shebang, and that essentially tells the shell how to run this script. So rather than saying Python 3, main.py, I can just type main.py, and my shell will look for this shebang to know how to interpret the file. So it'll say, oh, I'm supposed to use Python 3 to run this. So that ends up saving you a few keystrokes here and there. And if you want to distribute it to somebody else, they don't have to worry about calling it with the right version of Python or anything else. They can just call the script directly, and their shell will, interpret how to run this basically. So the other thing then is I always have a main function in my main.py. So I'm going to go ahead and return or define that here, just a blank return for right now. And essentially, you could just come in here and start writing your Python. My var equals hello, print, oops, my var, right? But realistically, if it were me, I would put these inside my main. My var equals hello, print my var. And then I would just tell, my script run main. I'm going to take this one step further though. We should always treat our code as if it is going to be imported somewhere else and used in a different way. So maybe we're not going to call projects main.py directly, but we're going to import project into a different, tool that we're writing or something, and use some of the libraries or functions that we wrote. So we have this special variable in Python called __name ___. And essentially that is a way to tell if this main.py was called directly or not. So we're going to say if name equals ___ main ___. And only if that's true do we want to run our main function. Also, I'm intentionally just adding a bunch of extra space here and kind of some gobbledygook, and you'll see why in a second. So anyway, so essentially what this line here, currently on line 15 does, it says if this special name variable is set to ___ main ___. And that's true if we run this main.py directly. So if I go back over to my terminal, I type Python 3 main.py, this is going to run. And basically that's because in that case, the name variable is set to this ___ main ___. I don't want to go too much into that. You kind of have to take my word for it. But trust me when I tell you that this is a really good habit to get into. So no matter how large or small a script I'm writing, I almost always try to set up my code this way. And for anything, maybe you're writing something that you're not going to run directly. It's only a bunch of includes that you're going to include in another project. Having a main function is a great way to just write some quick tests. So maybe main.py here, in this case, it probably wouldn't be called main.py if, it were just a bunch of supporting functions and libraries or whatever. But, I could just put a bunch of tests in main so that I could test the functionality of my functions if I had to. But for the most part, it would just be made to import somewhere else. So the reason I kind of made this all messy at this point is I wanted to show you how Autopy works. So I'm going to go ahead and save my main.py. And again, you can see we have a bunch of white space here. We've got some white space here. This is going to be a really small example of Autopy because obviously I don't have a lot of content here. But I can go ahead and run pep8 main.py. And if I run it just like this, it's going to spit out a new version of this. So what do I want to do though if I actually, so I look at this, I'm happy with these changes. I can go ahead and run it with the -i flag. and that stands for inline. So when I go ahead and do this, it's going to go ahead and actually just make those changes for me. And we can see, looking at VS Code now, what it looks like after Autopy is done running. So I almost always will commit a final version of my code before running Autopy because I know it's working and it's how I wrote it. And then I'll have one final commit in my Git repositories after I've run Autopy. And the commit message is almost always just Autopy. And that way, if that happens to break something, I have a good copy right before that I can roll back to or whatever. So yeah, that's essentially it for this project setup. What you see here in VS Code right now, from now on when I start doing videos about Python, I'm going to just start with this skeleton put in place. I'm going to have the gitignore put in place. I'm going to have the virtual environment put in place. So I highly recommend watching this video and understanding that, because it just saves me having to explain it every time. And hopefully it's helpful for you too. So the one other thing that I wanted to talk about real quick is just my VS Code settings. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a couple of things. Autosave, obviously all of these things are preferences, right? So do whatever makes you happy. But for me, I have my autosave set to on focus change. I'm flipping around between a web browser and VS Code and the terminal so often that my VS Code window frequently loses focus. So that's a pretty good autosave for me. Font size I have jacked up to 30. Part of that is just for recording purposes because it's easier for you guys to see. But I do have also a massive monitor, so having my font that large makes it really easy to see, but I still have plenty of room to actually spread out. Font family, whatever, this is the default. I haven't changed it. You can change yours if you want. Apparently JetBrains Mono is a pretty decent font released by JetBrains that's supposed to somehow enhance your ability to read your code. I used it for a little while. I didn't really notice anything, but here we are. Last thing I really want to point out is the tab size. So in Python, PEP8, which is Autopy8, PEP8 is a specification for Python for how your code should be formatted and how your file should be structured. And one of the things that's recommended, I don't know if it's strictly required or not by PEP8 though, is that in Python we don't use tabs, we use spaces, and every time we indent it should be 4 spaces. So you can just set VS Code to insert 4 spaces when you press tab, which is what I've done here. The detect indentation thing that is mentioned here right above, if I switch over to another language such as Golang, which does actually use tabs, VS Code is smart enough to know that Golang uses tabs, so it will override this setting and just use tabs for other languages. So you don't have to worry about changing this. It's fairly specific to whatever you're working on. Last one I'm going to mention is render whitespace. This is so when I go to my file, you can see the little dots like before my return here for spaces. And if I did insert a tab, God, I don't even know if I can force it to insert a tab instead of 4 spaces, but there's another character that it will insert to represent a tab. So I think it's a lot easier to see if those are there. I especially like it for the purposes of recording. I think it helps you all see. So yeah, that's just real quick view of my settings in case you're curious, you ever want to know, how I'm doing what I'm doing. Next video is going to be basically writing a Python script that will automatically set up a new project with this bare bones main in place, with the virtual environment in place, with the gitignore in place. So if you're interested in that, check out the next video and we'll talk about automating setting up a new project. Thanks for watching.